Russia says it is now in full control of the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. Ukrainian soldiers had held on to the plant for weeks despite being surrounded by Russian forces and facing constant bombardment. Ukrainian officials ordered them to surrender, hoping this would save their lives.
They've been evacuating for days, but the siege of this symbolic battleground appears to be finally over. In a video released, the commander of the Azov battalion says they've been ordered to abandon the defense of Mariupol.
Our commanders have given the order to save the lives of the men and to abandon the defense of the city. Work is underway to bring the bodies of the killed fighters out so that Ukraine can bury its heroes.
Defense experts fear there will now likely be a relocating of Russian forces. Troops from Mariupol could now support the offensive in other parts of eastern Ukraine, where the Russian assault is continuing in full force. Russian state television broadcast images of an offensive in Luhansk. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky says the bombardment of the Donbas region has been brutal.
This is a deliberate and criminal attempt to kill as many Ukrainians as possible, to destroy as many homes, social institutions and businesses as possible. This is genocide of the Ukrainian people, and the occupiers will be held accountable and brought to justice.
The governor of the Luhansk region, which is still under Ukrainian control, has reported further attacks where more people have been killed.
Well, DW correspondent Matthias Bullinger is in Kramatorsk. That's a city in the Donbas region, about 50 kilometres from the fighting. I asked him for an update on the situation in the city.
Well, it's already past curfew, so now I'm in the backyard of my hotel, and the city is eerily quiet, and today, and even in the daytime, we've never seen more than 3 or 4 people on the street, and that was the absolute maximum. Usually you see no one. Most of the people have left this city because it's the administrative center of the Donbas region, of those parts that are under Ukrainian control, and there were, of course, expectations that something might happen here. The city has been hit by rockets before. There was an attack on the railway station in the beginning of April where many civilians trying to flee the city died, and since then more and more people have left. Fighting is going on mostly northeast of here in Severodonetsk. That's another administrative center in this region. Shelling there is heavy. People die every day, and much of the city has already been destroyed.
Right. Both sides now, Ukraine and Russia, have now confirmed that the Azovstal steel plant is in Russian hands. And what are you hearing?
Yeah, it's what I have been hearing as well. Of course, the Ukrainian, the Azov battalion's commander has released a message today where they have said that they have had the order to give up and to save their lives and not to continue fighting under these conditions where they cannot win anything, they cannot get out. There's nothing they can do. They can just hold on until basically they die there. So they've been given the order to give up, which means to go into to give up, to surrender to the Russians, and Russia has now said that all of those who remained, 500, had surrendered. Needs confirmation from the Ukrainian side, but it's in line with what we've been hearing before.
Right. I know you were in Kharkiv earlier, where Russian troops have been driven back from the outskirts of the city. Now authorities there are keen to restore a normal life. We'll take a look at your report and then come back to you, Matthias.
They came here to flee the bombs and now they don't want to leave. People who have been living in the subway station are petitioning the government to let them stay. Subway stations here in Kharkiv have been serving as bomb shelters since the beginning of the war. Ekaterina Talpa and her husband have been living here since the very first day.
I go home every 3 weeks, but I always need to prepare myself mentally before I can go. Then I run home and take a bath. We can wash here, but the conditions are not ideal.
Others don't have a choice. They do not have a place to go back to anymore. This station is the terminal station of the metro line, the northernmost station in the city. It's closest to the front line and to those areas that have been most heavily shelled. The shelling of Kharkiv has all but subsided, and the local government wants to get the subway system running again. It wants the people to leave the metro and is offering to relocate them. But many here don't trust the peace.
I do go out on the street sometimes, but the fear is always there. It is not that easy. We need time to overcome it.
Around the subway station, many of the houses have been destroyed. In some streets, barely a house has been untouched. Olga has also spent the past months in a subway. It's the first time she's come back to see the apartment where she lived with her mother and her son. She was told that there was damage, but she didn't know how bad it was. It's terrible. A shell hit a wall in one of the rooms. There's debris everywhere. She documents everything. People can report the damage on the government website, but nobody knows how long it will take to get any support.
My knees are shaking. My knees are actually shaking. I still can't believe it. I knew that the windows were broken.
If only that shell hadn't hit.
Yeah, if there wasn't this hole in the wall, we might still somehow move back. The house is still standing, but this is different.
For now, the only thing to do is to collect some of their belongings. They will not move back to the subway, but to a relative's house.
Some distressing personal stories there, Matthias. What sort of state is the city in?
Well, it depends on where you are in the city. So these northern suburbs, this house where she was standing, it's the last house on the border of the town. And just behind, we could look out of the window, you see fields and then villages, and these villages were occupied by the Russian. So they were just able to shell from everything they have. Everything basically would hit at one of these houses because it was so close. And these areas are basically, I don't know whether they'll ever be inhabited, but probably you will have to tear everything down before they will be and rebuild it before it will be possible to live there. For most houses, they've been severely damaged. Other parts of the city are not that bad hit. There were a few rocket hits at the center. You see the city is wounded wherever you walk, and life is really returning slowly to the city, much slower than, for example, in Kiev. After the troops were driven back from the border of Kiev, basically life was returning already. But here it's different because the fighting is still ongoing. It's further from the city, and the shells don't hit the city anymore, but it's still ongoing, so people are much more careful to go back, and many shops are still closed, and it takes some time for people to readjust to the situation.
Okay, thank you for that, Matthias Bullinger in Kramatorsk. And we can talk to Lyubov Tipulska, who's a political analyst and advisor to the Ukrainian government and military. She joins us from Kyiv. Welcome to DW. What do you think prompted Kyiv to order those soldiers in Azovstal to surrender?
First of all, I think that our soldiers, our military in Azov plant, they accomplished their mission. They fought fiercely and selflessly. They fought till the last bullet, till the last ammunition. They did everything possible to evacuate civilians, wounded civilians, and the wounded military. So if they did this step, that it means that there was no other choice for them.
Right. And
the whole Ukraine perceives them as our heroes.
Understood, but I suppose that given that prisoners have been coming out of there over these last few days, one wonders, well, why today? Why not yesterday?
Why today? Because the situation was changing every day, I think, and it was their decision. And at that moment, it feels and it felt right.
Right. So,
but,
forgive me for interrupting you. I just want to be clear what you said there. You said this was the decision of the soldiers in Azovstal rather than them responding to orders from Kyiv.
No, it was a joint decision, obviously. The main goal was to save lives. And for many of them, it was one possible way to do it.
Understood. What do you think happens to them now? Talk of a prisoner swap seems to have died down.
We do not know for sure what is happening to them. We observe a lot of disinformation online on it issue, and details of these negotiations are not disclosed. So I think it's going to be another opportunity for us and for the whole world to see whether Russia is sticking to the agreements. So far, history has shown that Russia always violates any agreements.
But as far as you understand, those talks about a prisoner stop are still going on?
Yes, we keep hearing this, but we also observe a lot of information, especially on Russian domain, on prosecuting them. So we do not have a clear vision what is going to happen.
And now that Russian troops aren't tied up in Mariupol, the fear is that they'll be deployed to step up the assault on Donbas. What's your feeling?
I think that the amount of troops, Russian troops, at that area was not very significant. So if they are deployed to other parts of eastern Ukraine, it's not going to change the whole situation.
Understood. Thank you so much for joining us. Lyubov Tipolska, advisor to the Ukrainian government. Thank you.
Thank you.
Some other developments in this war, starting in Germany, where the Defence Ministry says it will deliver the first of its 15 Gepard or Cheetah anti-air tanks to Ukraine in July. Kyiv has been pleading for more heavy weaponry to battle Russian troops in the east. Critics accuse Germany of taking too long to deliver military aid. Several people have been injured in a Russian strike on a Ukrainian culture centre. President Zelensky released this surveillance footage of the attack on the town of Lazova in the eastern region of Kharkiv. He said Russian forces deliberately targeted the centre. Ukraine has accused Russia of routinely striking civilian targets. And G7 ministers have warned that the war is causing global economic disruptions, impacting energy supply, food production and export, as well as the functioning of supply chains around the world. Ukraine accuses Russia of deliberately targeting food supply infrastructure. Russian missiles took out a grain warehouse in eastern Ukraine on Thursday. Officials say the storage facility southeast of Zaporizhia is now completely unusable. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has accused Russia of using food as a weapon with global consequences. Ukraine is one of the world's most important suppliers of grain and sunflower oil, but Russia's blockade of Black Sea ports has halted shipments.
The colours of Ukraine, the country's endless golden wheat fields, are reflected in its flag. But Russia's invasion means some of Ukraine's rich farmland now looks like this. Ukraine has accused Russia of deliberately targeting its agriculture sector, tearing up fields, planting landmines and destroying equipment and warehouses. In safer parts of the country, farmers have been tasked with planting extra crops in a bid to make up for the losses elsewhere. But the threat to food security goes far beyond Ukraine. The country is one of the world's biggest exporters of food products like wheat, corn and sunflower oil. But Russia has blocked Ukraine's key ports, leaving it unable to ship vital food supplies. Without our agricultural exports, dozens of countries in different parts of the world are already on the brink of food shortages. And over time, the situation could become, frankly speaking, terrible. Politicians are already discussing the possible consequences of the sharp rise in prices, famine in African countries, Asian countries. Russia has blamed the situation on Western sanctions. But some experts suggest Russia is manipulating grain markets, using wheat as a bargaining chip to its own advantage. As the world's #1 wheat exporter, there are warnings Russia could withhold its own wheat exports for political gain. According to the World Food Programme, around 4.5 million tonnes of grain is stuck in silos at Ukrainian ports. It's particularly disastrous for countries already suffering from food shortages. Yemen, for example, gets more than half of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia.
This war, the Ukraine war, is overlapping. The impact is overlapping with a crisis that has already been unfolding in several countries.
The EU is now racing to work out alternative routes across land to secure supply chains. Meanwhile, the UN is leading negotiations to get shipping routes reopened and get vital food supplies to where they're desperately needed.
Let's look at this with Michael Kimmage. He's Professor of History at the Catholic University of America and a Fellow of the German Marshall Fund. He served as an expert on Russia and Ukraine for President Obama's State Department. Well, welcome to DW. Looking at what's going on there, is this a pattern that you see? Do you see Russia deliberately creating food shortages around the world as part of this war?
I'm not sure if it's a deliberate creation of a food shortage. It's certainly a consequence of the war, and I don't think that Russia will lift its naval embargo of Ukraine for many reasons. What it will try to do is to exploit this crisis to make it the fault of Western intransigence, NATO expansion and such. It will try to use it for propaganda purposes.
Everyone's at this propaganda game, though, aren't they? Because, you know, the West is there imposing sanctions on Russia, regarding it as a legitimate tactic to try and bring down its banking system. And of course, if we can do that, why shouldn't Russia try to do the same with whatever tools it has at its disposal?
Well, I don't think that Western policy is to bring down Russia's banking system. The goal of the sanctions policy is to limit the development of Russia's war machine. So it's targeted, and I don't think that sort of sabotaging the world's food supply is a proportional response to that. So these are two separate tracks, I would say. But yes, all of this is a feature of widening tension between Russia and the West, and that's going to be a very long-term phenomenon with many, many negative consequences.
So let's pick up that idea of each side blaming the other. As I say, the West imposes those sanctions on Russian fuel and the banking system, and Russia and its apologists and its friends say, well, this is the West side. So we'll hear from China's permanent representative to the United Nations, Zhang Jun.
Weaponizing economic interdependence will only create artificial difficulties and amplify local risks. We call for the lifting of unilateral sanctions and restrictions on food production and exports as soon as possible, so as to stabilize and smooth food production and supply.
Michael Kimmage, do you buy that? The West removes its sanctions and Russia lets the grain out of Ukrainian ports and the problem goes away. Seems to go that thinking.
It doesn't really make any sense from a Western point of view. The sanctions are there because of the war and the violations of Ukrainian sovereignty, and I think it's for that reason that the sanctions have to stay. If something can be worked out about the grain, that would be excellent, but it wouldn't be through sanctions relief. That's just not gonna. It's not gonna happen on the Western side, and it shouldn't, because it's not connected to the stated aims of the sanctions policy.
Okay, so both sides say it's your fault and we're not moving. I wonder if you could just expand on an idea that was touched on in our report, that Russia could also withhold its own wheat from the market for political gain. Because on the face of it, this seems like the last thing that a cash-strapped, severely sanctioned country with limited access to international markets would do.
It's very true. It doesn't seem like there's any reputational gain in Russia in doing that. They would just seem a less reliable supplier of grain to those parts of the world that consume Russian grain. So it would be an odd policy, unless the Russian calculation is that this instability that the global grain shortage is going to cause, that the instability is so useful to Russia that it would do it for that sake. But that, seems like a very a very unusual policy, putting it mildly.
Well, this has been an unusual conflict, hasn't it? Because on the one side, OK, we have what we understand. We have the bombs and the bullets flying. But on the other, we have all these other weapons being used, whether it be the food or fuel and the rest of it. We're in this so-called hybrid warfare. Have you seen its like before?
No, I think that this is a very perplexing war. And it's, very local and regional up to a point. I mean, the battlefields are all on the territory of Ukraine, but it's certainly a war that's global in scope and meaning. And, from that, you can extract one significant point, which is that the Western response to the war in Ukraine has been much more critical of Russia than the global response. So that's certainly something that Russia is going to try to turn to its advantage, and that may be where some of this grain politics comes into play.
And it's interesting that the battle lines, as it were, in terms of who's for and against Russia aren't clear. You look at countries like India or indeed Turkey, which has interests on both sides of this.
No, that's correct. Also, Brazil, South Africa, and most importantly, China. I don't think any of these countries really strongly supports the war or thinks that the war is a good idea. But at the same time, they don't strongly oppose it. They're not a part of the sanctions regime, and they are trying to operate in their individual ways to benefit at times from being either in between or closer to the Russian side. So it's a very important part of the picture.
And one of the things that has perplexed lots of observers has been the lack of what would appear to be a cyber response, because Russia's been accused of exploiting tactics in cyberspace for years, disrupting elections and referendums in foreign countries. Yet we don't appear to have seen so much of this in this current hot war. Why do you think that is?
Well, not yet. I mean, don't forget that it's early days for this war. It's about 2.5 months old, so we'll see what the future brings in this regard. I think that there's one clear explanation, which is that Russia has undermined a lot of the political support that it had before the war. So it doesn't have as much to work with now in terms of, information meddling, political meddling and such. But where I would anticipate cyber attacks in the future would be on critical infrastructure in places like Poland, the Baltic republics, or perhaps Germany or the United States. I don't think that that's science fiction at all. It's a probable outcome if the war continues to escalate.
And a very material way that this has sort of spread out. We've seen Russia switch off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria, and Finland is next on the list from Saturday. Why do you think Russia has picked those particular targets? Well, Finland we know, but why start with Bulgaria and Poland when there are bigger, fatter fish like Germany or Hungary?
Well, Poland has been, really front and center with this crisis. It's taken in a very large number of refugees, and Poland is the country from which weapons are flowing into Ukraine. So I think it's just a target for Russian animosity. And then in other countries, it's degrees of vulnerability and degrees of leverage. Germany may be vulnerable, but it still has lots of leverage. Bulgaria is in a different situation.
Good talk. Thank you so much for joining us. Michael Kimmich from the Catholic University of America and the German Marshall Fund.
Thank you for having me.
Germany's Chancellor says Qatar will play a central role in his country's plans to cut its dependence on Russian gas. Olaf Scholz made the remarks after hosting the Emir of Qatar, Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, at talks here in Berlin. Qatar is the world's leading producer of liquefied natural gas and hopes to start sending the fuel to Germany by 2024. Chancellor Scholz said Germany would develop its infrastructure to import LNG by ship. And while Germany prepares to do without Russian gas, Finland has had this thrust upon it. Russian gas giant Gazprom's cutting off supplies just days after Finland applied to join NATO. Moscow says it's because Helsinki's refused to pay in rubles, but gas only accounts for 5% of Finland's energy needs, and officials say there'll be no disruption to consumers as Helsinki's already signed a replacement deal with a US company. So let's explore this side of this war with Dr. Benjamin Schmidt. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He's also served as European Energy Security Advisor to the US State Department. Welcome back to DW. So Russia says it's cutting Finland off because Helsinki isn't paying for this gas in rubles, which of course was a condition that Moscow imposed in response to Western banking sanctions. But presumably we should read this as a punishment for Finland seeking NATO membership.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, Phil, what we can see here, this is just the latest move in a long-running Kremlin-instigated gas crisis that it has built up in Europe since mid-2021, all to undermine the West's response to Russia's later re-invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen these cynical statements where Gazprom apologists and defenders, people like Dmitry Peskov, people like former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, they continue to perform implausible logical gymnastics to try to explain away this company's behavior as, quote, just commercial. And they really, represent kind of this extraordinary conductors of a decades-long symphony of absurdity, aiming to drown out anything that doesn't harmonize with variations on the Kremlin's really farcical refrain that, quote, Russia has always been a reliable energy supplier to Europe. I identified on Twitter just last week a thread with over 25 different interruptions and other non-market actions. And of course, Finland's energy cutoffs, last week electricity and upcoming gas cutoffs, this is right in that wheelhouse.
All right, so Germany is now looking to Qatar for its LNG supplies. But one wonders what sort of bargain you can strike when the market knows that you are desperate. We'll hear from Germany's economy minister, Robert Habeck, and then we'll come back to you.
It's obvious that we need natural gas if we want to get rid of Russian natural gas. This is the situation, but we won't be hijacked, and if someone is using this situation to asking for too high prices or too long-term contracts, then we will find other partners.
Benjamin Schmidt, how done is this deal with Qataris? Can Germany dictate terms or walk away?
Well, they certainly can walk away. I mean, the big thing to remember about LNG is that unlike oil, it's less fungible, but it is going in that direction, right? So it is something that you can go to a global market and try to replace volumes. And I think the most heartening act that I've seen since since Germany's well-publicized Zeitenwende, this supposed era of Kremlin deterrence, which we haven't seen fully yet, but maybe things are going in the right direction. We saw Minister Habeck boldly predict on May 5th, a good chance to do what is normally impossible in Germany. He said to build an LNG terminal at Wilhelmshaven within about 10 months and connected to the German gas supply. And he also came out just last week and called Kremlin energy practices as a weaponization of energy, or using energy as a weapon. This is something that was unthinkable from the Merkel government and certainly unthinkable from former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. So, I mean, it's really encouraging that the physical infrastructure for imports is being moved along quickly in Germany. At the same time, this sort of deal with Qatar, this will take time to work out, but I think that it can be part of the solution for diversification in Germany. And I'm really hopeful the fact that we've seen these talks going on. This will take time, but it's really needed because you have to get these gas storages up.
There are many who would query whether this is a deal that should be done at all. There's a horrific irony about turning away from one dictator waging a war on your doorstep to another miles away in Qatar with an equally questionable human rights record.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I mean, this is kind of the curse that we have with hydrocarbons, this petro-dictator and authoritarian nations that are built on hydrocarbon sales, and that's why we're seeing the same sort of issues play out with the Saudis, with the Qataris, with the Venezuelan government, the Russian government, et cetera. Right? This just goes on, and this is all the more reason that we need to work to reduce our energy dependence on, in particular, authoritarian nations, and try to diversify energy supplies to the greatest extent possible.
Right, and so presumably then, in this circumstance, Berlin's not in a position to impose conditions ethically or otherwise?
It's not clear. I mean, it's a little bit different from these long-term contracts that Berlin had in previous governments tried to build in. Remember, as the rest of the European Union from 2015, after Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine, was working to actively diversify away from overdependence on Russian natural gas in particular, but energy in general, Germany took the other approach. It followed this flawed Ostpolitik policy where it was trying to actually entrench its energy relationship through the now defunct Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And these are the sort of things that Germany is actively moving away from. And getting onto the global market is really, a big, big step. It's something that other countries like Poland and Bulgaria and others, which I heard you talking about earlier, they've already taken those steps. Germany really needs to take a page out of their energy security playbook to become more resilient to Kremlin pressure.
As ever, good talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us. Dr. Benjamin Schmidt from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics.